The reading for this morning is from John chapter 4, verses 4 to 9. And I'd encourage you to read the rest of the chapter after this meditation. John 4, verses 4 to 9. Now Jesus had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. This is the very first time I have preached to an empty church, and we're doing so on the advice of Manitoba Health. Manitoba Health has asked organizations and businesses and schools to practice social distancing. Early on in the week, when we sent out an email to the congregation, we said that would mean that when you came to church, we'd encourage you not to shake hands, and we wouldn't serve coffee like we usually do. Later on in the week, we found out that Manitoba Health was saying, really, there shouldn't be any large gatherings of people, especially gatherings of people of 250 people or more. And since that's about the size of our church on a Sunday morning, we decided that we needed to cancel our worship services. Manitoba Health calls this social distancing. Now, we already have the skills to practice social distancing because we use it all the time. The difference is we don't avoid all people, we only avoid some people. And we do this at work, we do it at school, we do it at family gatherings, we even do it here at church sometimes in the foyer or in the hallways, or trying to decide where we're going to sit in the sanctuary. And we practice it based on how much we like the person, perhaps their political views or their theological views, perhaps if we've gotten into a recent argument with them, or maybe they've just been cool to us. And so when we see them at work or we see them at school, we just keep our distance. That's social distancing. Social distancing was baked into the Old Testament law. It was seen as a good thing because Israel was told to keep its distance from its neighbors. Israel was told, when you look at the countries around you, don't marry those people, don't worship with them, make sure you look and dress differently from your neighbors, even eat a distinct diet, not because it's healthier, but because it will remind you that you are different than your neighbors. And so the Jews were very careful about all these things. They were careful about the way they looked, they were careful about the way they dressed, and they were especially careful about what they ate. And if there was any question that what they were eating was in the unclean list in the Old Testament, they would just avoid it. And in fact, they would avoid cooking utensils that might have been used to cook some of these unclean animals. And so Jews were very careful to say, we are only going to cook using pots and dishes, knowing the history of those pots and dishes. We're not going to take a chance using dishes and pots that Gentiles might have used, because uncleanness, ceremonial uncleanness, could be transferred from a Gentile person to a pot to a ritually clean Jew. The story that we just read has social and religious distancing at its foundation. Jesus is on a trip, and he's going from Judea up to Galilee. Judea is in the south, then there's Samaria in the middle, and Galilee is the province in the north. And a few Jews, not many of them, if they wanted to go to Judea, from Judea to Galilee, they would go around the long way, sort of take the perimeter around Samaria so that they could avoid it. But most Jews didn't do that. They went through Samaria, but they just tried to stay clear of the Samaritans. But they couldn't do it totally because it wasn't like they could take the train or the bus. They had to walk it. Perhaps they had some animal transportation, but it would take a couple of days. And so along the way, they would have to buy food from Samaritans and perhaps seek even hospitality from Samaritans. Who were the Samaritans? Well, the Samaritans were the cousins to the Jews. They were Jewish people who, about 5-6 centuries before, had intermarried with Assyrians. And slowly their faith had evolved in a different direction than the Jews. Instead of having the whole Old Testament like the Jews had and we have, the Samaritans said, no, we only think the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, are the books that God really wants us to read and reverence. So they only used those first 5 books, so they were missing the riches of the Psalms and the prophets. And when the Jews returned from exile in around 528 BC, and their temple was destroyed, the Samaritans said, we'll help you rebuild it. But the Jews said, no thanks, we're going to do this one on our own. And they rebuffed the Samaritans' help. And so the Samaritans said, it's no longer really viable for us to go up to Jerusalem and worship at that temple. We're going to build our own temple. And so in the middle of Samaria, at a place called Mount Gerizim, around 400 BC, the Samaritans built their own temple. The Jews thought this was a sacrilege, and so about 120 BC, about 150 years before Jesus' ministry, Jewish forces came in and destroyed the Samaritan temple. So there was really bad blood between the Samaritans and the Jews. Jesus is walking through Samaria, and he comes to a town called Sychar. And Jesus, after walking in the hot sun, he is tired. He is thirsty. And perhaps his disciples have a little more energy, and so they say, we're going to go into town and buy some food. And Jesus says, I'm staying here at the well. But he really can't drink from the well because it is a very, very deep well. That well is still there, and it's estimated to be about 100 to 140 feet deep. And so the disciples walk the last mile into town, and Jesus rests by the well. And while he's resting there, in the middle of the day, a woman comes from the town of Sychar to fetch some water. Now, that might have been an unusual thing to do, to go fetch water a long distance in the middle of the day. I know when I lived in rural Africa, people fetched water from much closer wells at the beginning of the day and the end of the day to avoid the heat of noon. But this woman comes out all by herself, long walk, and she's fetching water. And I wonder what she thought as she got close to the well and saw a strange man sitting there. Was she frightened? Did she wonder, well, who is that guy? Is he going to hit on me or something like that? Or is it going to be violent? Is he going to attack me? Or, is it going to be awkward because we'll have nothing to talk about? And so she comes near the well, and Jesus asks her, will you give me a drink of water? And she is surprised by this. She says, you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman? How can you ask me for a drink? Because she's very surprised that Jesus is actually going to drink from her jar. What she's really saying is, aren't you afraid of social distance? Aren't you afraid that you're going to get too close? Aren't you afraid that you're going to catch something from me? But we know what Jesus was like. He was someone who constantly was working to reduce social distance. He frequently was called a friend of tax collectors and sinners. In an age when many rabbis tried to avoid almost all contact with women, he had close female friends, Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene. And then there's that story where one day he's at the home of a Pharisee and a woman comes in and she's overwhelmed with emotion, and she has a bit of a disreputable past. And when she sees Jesus, she's in tears, and her tears just are falling, and she uses her tears to clean Jesus' feet, and she wipes Jesus' feet with her hair. That's awkward. And Jesus is good with that. He's good with this reduced social distance. If we read through this story in John chapter 4, we get to the end, and after a long conversation, I'm not going to talk about that this morning, but after a long conversation, the disciples show up, and they're shocked because Jesus and this woman are deep in conversation. And so they look at Jesus, but it says they don't say anything. They don't say anything. They just look. I wonder what this woman felt like. She was having this good conversation with a man she didn't expect to have a conversation with. She's beginning to think that he is a prophet. She even thinks he might be the Messiah. And suddenly 12 strange men show up and they just stare at her. And so the text said she hurries away and she even leaves her jar there at the well. When I read through this text this morning and earlier in this week, I was ticked with the disciples. Like, how rude are you guys? Just to sort of stand back and not say a word. After all, they had already spent some time with Jesus, and they were his disciples. They were his apprentices. They were learning to do the things that Jesus was doing, because in his absence, they would be called upon to preach and to teach and to do miracles even, and to tell people about the kingdom of God. But they still hadn't gotten this thing about reduced social distance. It would take them a long time. It would take them years to get this. In fact, a couple years later, there's another story in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus and his disciples are coming back down from Galilee, heading towards Jerusalem, and they go to another village and they get a poor reception, not a warm reception, and the disciples are so mad at the Samaritans, they say, Jesus, would you like us to pray that God would send down fire and destroy these Samaritans? They want to kill people. They want to kill Samaritans for rudeness. They didn't get what Jesus was trying to do when he was reducing social distance. Eventually, but only after Jesus' death and resurrection and his ascension, did the disciples get it. And years later, they would be in Samaria, preaching and teaching and telling the good news and baptizing people and laying on hands. But that would take a while. One of Jesus' later disciples, the Apostle Paul, in Romans chapter 12, verse 13, he tells his readers to pursue hospitality. What is hospitality? About a week ago, James and Karen invited Kathleen and I over to their home for dinner. And it really felt like they went all out. They made a wonderful supper, and we had a good time. We ate well, and the conversation was good and comfortable. And we came home and we just went, that was a wonderful visit. We've had a couple of those visits in the last few weeks. And people were really, really hospitable to us. But when the Apostle Paul says, practice hospitality or pursue hospitality, he's not talking about what James and Karen did. Because you have to know what the word hospitality means in Greek. When Paul says in Greek, pursue hospitality, the word is actually pursue philoxenia. Now, I know very few people know Greek, and I'm very poor at Greek. But there's a word that's like philoxenia that many of you know, and that's xenophobia. Xenophobia is an English word based on a Greek word, which means fear of strangers, or fear of people who are different from us. And so it's made up of two words, xeno, which means different, and phobia, which means fear. So xenophobia is fear of people who are different than us. But this is philoxenia. Many of you know that Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. Phila, love, Adelphia, brother. So this is philoxenia, which means literally the love of strange people. And so what Paul says is he says, practice. No, he actually says it's stronger than that. He says, pursue the love of strange people. That's what Jesus is doing here in John 4. He's pursuing the love. He's pursuing to love strangers. And that is just plain weird. Now, I'd say there's two cautions here. First of all, philoxenia, or pursuing the love of the stranger, doesn't mean that we just have pleasant and light conversation. If you read the whole chapter, you'll see that Jesus is willing to talk about very tough things with this woman who he has a great love for. He talks about her past. She was married 5 times and now was living with somebody else. He talks to her very bluntly about the inadequacy of the Samaritan religion and how the Jewish faith was much clearer about the things of God. But he had this tough conversation in the context of great love and respect for this woman. And there are times even in the church when we will practice some social distancing. In fact, Jesus talks about it in Matthew 18, if someone is unrepentant about their sin. There's a time when the church comes together, and as a church body, that decision is made to practice social distancing. But these are extraordinary situations. Our default position needs to be to reduce social distance, to practice or to pursue philoxenia. So here's my question for you this morning. Who is your Samaritan? Who is your Samaritan? I'm sure you have Samaritans in your life, people who you just don't like being around. Maybe it's their political views that just drive you around the bend. Maybe you call them social justice warriors and you just go, I've had so much of them. Or maybe they're highly conservative people who don't want to change their minds, and you go, those are people I just prefer to keep my distance from. Or perhaps it's not based on politics. Perhaps the people who are your Samaritans, it's based on religion. Maybe it's people from another religion who you're scared of or you think are wrecking the world. Maybe it's atheists. Or maybe it's even certain kinds of other Christians. Maybe your Samaritan are liberal, inclusive Christians. Maybe your Samaritan are evangelical or judgmental Christians. Take a moment and think. Who is your Samaritan? And what would it be like to display hospitality, to show philoxenia, to reduce social distance with them? As I thought about this story, the disciples must have been amazed at what Jesus was doing by practicing philoxenia, by reducing social distance with this Samaritan woman. But in the end, this conversation he had with the Samaritan woman wasn't the big boundary he was crossing. Because the distance wasn't so big between Jesus and this Samaritan woman as it was between Jesus and all humanity. Because the disciples were much closer to the Samaritan woman in status than they were to Jesus. After all, at the end of the story, many people in that village come to believe that Jesus is the Savior of the world. Jesus is God incarnate. And so the surprise is not that Jesus was talking to the Samaritan woman. The surprise is not even that Jesus talked to any human being. The surprise is that God became human in Jesus Christ. Philippians 2 puts it this way. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. We're not meeting this morning because we don't want to be contaminated. But yet, Jesus met with us, became like us, lived among us precisely so that he could become contaminated by our sin, so that he could be touched by our sin. 1 Peter 2:24 puts it this way. Jesus himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds we were healed. Do you see what Peter is saying? He's saying Jesus became sick so that we could be well. Jesus died so that we could live. Jesus faced this pandemic of sin so that we might be healed of the eternal consequences of that sin. And so in response to this great, great love and this great, great love, we seek out those who are different from us because we are no longer afraid of them. We are no longer angry of them, but we see ourselves in them and we realize we are brothers and sisters with the Samaritans. Amen.